And we are live.
Okay. Well, all right. Well, welcome to everyone who has joined us today for Fashionable History. We're really excited about this program. Today's program is brought to you by the Mary Washington House and the James Monroe Museum. And we are very, very happy. We're thrilled that you're here for a virtual presentation by our esteemed presenter, Nastasia Parker. After Ms. Parker's presentation, we will have a question and answer session led by our public programs coordinator, Lindsay Crawford. There she is. Followed by artifact presentations from myself and Michelle Hamilton of Mary Washington House, which is then followed by another question and answer session. So feel free to leave any questions you have in the comment section of this live stream. Nastasia Parker has been a historical character interpreter and reenactor since 1995. More recently, she has served as a contracted consultant where she specializes in museum public programming. She has conducted lectures on topics such as 18th century fashion, women's history, and portrays famous and little-known figures of African-American history, such as Ona Judge, Jemimiah Banneker, and Sally Hemings. In one-woman shows and public programs. In 2019, she was an extra in the recent blockbuster movie Harriet. How cool is that? When she is not researching and developing the new programs, Nastasia also spends her time sewing historical costumes. Michelle L. Hamilton earned her MA in history from San Diego State University. Hamilton is the author or editor of several books, including I Would Still Be Drowned in Tears, Spiritualism in Abraham Lincoln's White House, and Mary Ball Washington, the mother of George Washington. She's currently the manager of the Mary Washington House in Fredericksburg, Virginia. I am the assistant director and curator of the James Monroe Museum. The museum has the nation's largest collection of James Monroe artifacts and is administered by the University of Mary Washington. The museum works closely with university students using our collections to educate future museum professionals. Well, we are absolutely thrilled that you're watching, and without further ado, let's turn it over to our presenter, Ms. Parker.
Hi, everybody. Now I'm going to be reading from cards. So what I'm going to do is basically turn my video off. Okay. I think I have it. Can everybody still see me?
Yes, we can see your presentation.
Okay. Okay, so the presentation is called Fashionable History, a history of clothing during the times of President James Monroe and Mary Ball Washington. So the fabrics that were predominantly used in the 18th and 19th century were silk, cotton, linen, wool, linsey woolsey, which is a combination of both linen and wool, Osnaburg, which is a rough type of linen used, hemp, and of course traded animal furs. Now, natural fibers were mostly dyed using, well, natural dyes. Synthetic dyes did not, of course, come about until the later half of the 18th or 19th century. Now, Mary Ball Washington was born in between 1708 and died in 1789. She was the daughter of Colonel Joseph Ball and Mary Johnson. And of course, she was born in Lancaster County, Virginia, and died in Fredericksburg, Virginia. She was the second wife of Augustine Washington, to which she had 5 surviving children, of course, George Washington being the most famous. After the death of her husband, she chose to remain a widow, mostly to keep the farm, Ferry Farm, in her name, so that way her sons would be able to have the rights to the property after she died. She lived pretty much a normal life as a Virginia planter. She was a devoted mother to her children and, of course, a devoted attendee to the church. She did have a bit of a strained relationship with her son, George Washington, but as any mother would, she did love her son and cared for his well-being. After all, they both had very similar personalities. They were both very headstrong. Now we're going to start with the Georgian period, which is between 1714 and 1790. Now, during the reign of King George II and King George III, the style is what we currently identify as the 18th century fashion to be. The silhouette for women was mostly of a conical shape, of course, with large hips, while menswear had changed drastically from the cavalier look during the 1750s to a more subdued and humble silhouette. The coat, of course, was cut away and closer to the body, and of course, tricorn hats mostly became popular as the cravat as well as the neck stock. So the bare essentials, starting, of course, from 1760 to 1780, women's undergarments or underpinnings were made mostly not just for practicality, but also to accentuate the features that supported the silhouette. The shift, which is the first article of clothing, was to be worn, which is this article right here. It is closest to the body and therefore the dirtiest part of the clothing. This, of course, protects the outer clothes from sweat and bodily oils. The stays, which is right here, was designed mainly for back and bust support. Its conical shape played a major part in, of course, the silhouette. Your pocket hoops, or also a bum roll, later a bum pad, which right here are your pocket hoops, and the bum roll is up here. This would help with over exaggeration and of the illusion, as well as making your hips a lot larger. This definitely was made prevalent during the 1750s and of course with your court fashion. Your under petticoat, this area here and as well as here, they would help smooth everything down at the hips just to make the shape more softer. And of course your stomacher, was sometimes used depending on the style of the gown, and it was pinned over top of the stays. So this right here is what your stomacher would look like over top of your gown. Your men's underpinnings were very practical and of course simple. It consisted of a long shirt that was worn over the body. And after that, you're putting on, of course, your stockings and a pair of under breeches, which came down to the knee. After that, of course, was your regular breeches, which will be worn over underneath a waistcoat and a coat. Now I'm going to talk about your classes for a minute. Right here, I have three different examples of your type of classes: your gentry, your middle class, and of course, your working class. For your gentry, due to the financial availability and social status, traded goods that were imported, such as silks, European fashions, etc., it was better accessible to people of the gentry. It also helped that they had access to their trusted mantua maker or your tailors. Now, I also want to point out that tailors and mantua makers or seamstresses were also accessible to all classes. It depended on how fancy you wanted your outfit and what amount of money that you had. Sometimes you could also pay in fabric. For your middle class, it's basically the same as the gentry. If fabrics that were either imported or stateside made were accessible to your financial needs, you would be able to take it to your seamstress or tailor and have it made for you. At times, depending on your occupation, if you were going to be working or due to religious restrictions, then your choice of fashion would be toned down, and of course, your practicality. For your working class, again, for merchants or sailors or domestic workers, or people who were in a lower income group, you mostly dress for comfort and what was practical to you. You wouldn't be wearing a silk gown or a suit if you were, working in the brickyard or tending to the garden. Also, there is a speculation that your working class individuals did not own silks or etc. That they could not afford a nice dress or a hat. Thing is, again, if you could afford it, you could have it. So that would actually also be worn for special occasions such as churches or a ball or anything like that. And here is, of course, your example for your menswear. Here, your gentry class, your fine tailored suits, your silks, your brocades. Your middle class, you basically, wore what you sold, especially if you were a tailor. Your working class, again, practicality. For your wedding attire, contrary to popular tradition, wedding dresses were not white. They did not wear the same accoutrements, such as your veil, your garters, your something blue. These were Victorian traditions that were made popular by Queen Victoria when she got married. Wedding dresses could have been your best gown that you wore for formal occasions or to church. Now, in Mary Ball Washington's case in 1731, she married Augustine Washington on March 6th when she was 22 years old. George Eskridge, Mary's charge, supposedly introduced the two. In 1750, Martha Dandridge married Daniel Parke Custis, but after his death in 1757, Martha Custis remarried to George Washington in 1759 in Kent County, Virginia. She was only 27 years old. Now, right here is a wonderful example of Martha Washington's wedding gown. It was a deep yellow brocade with rich lace in the neck and the sleeves. Fabrics, of course, were supposedly imported. The petticoat is, of course, a white silk with a silver embroidery. And of course, the shoes were a purple satin with silver trimming. Now I'm going to go over to the fashion and politics part, which, the fun part of it. Now, during the age of the homespun movement, during the American Revolution, colonists began making their own clothes and textiles in protest of trade goods from England. They used resources that were already been available to them in the United States, such as wool, hemp, cotton, linen, etc. Silks, unfortunately, were not stateside made; they were imported. So, unfortunately, we did not have access to those items. Fibers, of course, were hand spun on a drop spindle, or of course a spinning wheel if you happen to have one, and then woven into fabric. This was the first time that textiles were used or made during the wartime in the United States. Women mostly took up this job and would do the work from home. If they did not have a weaving loom, they go, of course, to a weaver's to have the fabric finished. And of course, this was the precursor to the Industrial Revolution in 1790 to 1830. Not only was Mary Washington a supporter of the homespun movement, so was Martha Washington, as they both were supporters of the reform. Even Martha had her own clothes made from home and even went to as far as to be a patron to businesses who were following the practice. As far as Mary Washington is concerned, she actually had 3 swatches of fabrics that were made, and I believe they're being studied at Colonial Williamsburg as we speak. Now, there has been some speculation, though, with the American Revolution through many stories and by association that she supported either the revolution or as a crown as a loyalist. Towards the end of the American Revolution, she was, of course, on the patriotic side, but all in all, the results are still inconclusive. We really don't know. She did, of course, have family members, such as George Washington being the commander-in-chief, as well as 3 of her sons join the militia. Her son-in-law, of course, was in charge of the Fredericksburg Gunnery, which made muskets for the American Revolution, as well as her grandsons who joined the army. And of course, these, of course, are your good examples of the homespun movement. So for your later half of the late Georgian period, which is between 1780 and 1790, you'll start to see a change in the fashion. The bodices in the front of the gown are now closing in the front, right above here, rather than using a stomacher. The 3/4 sleeves are sometimes still around, but they're getting longer to actually your full length sleeves. And of course, the silhouette is still the same. However, it does start to change a little bit. Men's clothing, here's another example, also experienced another change. The front of the jackets were cut away, as were the tails of the bottom of the jacket, they were kind of cut straight across. And as mentioned, of course, prior to the tricorn hat, well, that was no longer in fashion. So top hats were starting to become popular. Now, the bare essentials of the 1780s and the 1800s. So these were your underpinnings at the time. So by 1780s, stays were still prevalent as, of course, your main undergarment. As the fashion began to change in the last quarter of the century, then of course, so did the stays. Transitional stays began to come about when the focus of the waistline moves up to the bust line, mimicking the classical Greek silhouette. This meant that the stays needed to be more streamlined and natural, as well as accentuate the bust. Busks, which is this piece here, which was actually made out of wood, they were still used for posture purposes. And I have another picture here. The famous bum roll or bum shop. Bum rolls or bum pads that help accentuate the hips also they made way for basically the bum pads, not only to make the rump look more exaggerated, but the piece also made, they were stuffed with cork or goose down or goose feathers. So unfortunately, during this time, now we're getting into mourning here. Around April 12th, 1743, Augustine Washington died at Ferry Farm at the age between 48 and 49 years old due to a stomach ailment. Unfortunately, this lasted for 3 days and he died. His son, George Washington, inherited the former Strother property, including 11 enslaved. After her long battle with breast cancer, Mary Ball Washington died in her home in Fredericksburg, Virginia, August 25th, 1789. The funeral procession would have been taken place later on in the week, which, you would need the undertaker, the minister, the priest, the gravesite, all of that would have to be prepared during that time. She was buried on the 28th, of course. And not everybody wore Black. The mourning attire was not as strict as what you would see in the 1800s or beyond. Of course, while customs were adhered to, it also depended on your preference. According to one story, there's an account of a man who basically advised his family not to not to be in mourning for a day or so. So after that mourning period had come and gone, the family just went back to wearing regular clothing. And of course, as I mentioned before, not everybody wore Black. Sometimes they wore gray or white or dull colors. Sometimes they would even wear a black band around the arm. And right here, this lady, for example, this woman is wearing white. Of course, she is in mourning. However, another lady here is wearing all gray. And here is actually Mary Ball Washington's memorial. And this was actually taken from a New York clipping. So on Tuesday last, being the first public levee at the president's since his mother's decease was known in the city, several gentlemen of the two houses of Congress and other respectable persons attended it in American mourning. This silent mark of respect following spontaneously from the hearts of free men sympathizing with him in this domestic misfortune, manifest sentiments and emotions which no language can express in a manner so unequivocal and delicate. So now we go on to James Monroe, who was born 1758 and died in 1831. He was an American Revolution veteran. He was elected U.S. Senator in 1790, Governor of Virginia in 1800, Secretary of State in 1811, and of course, President of the United States in 1816. He signed the Missouri Compromise in 1820, as well as the Monroe Doctrine in 1823, and of course, retired from presidency in 1825. During the American Revolution, James Monroe left school to join the fight against the Crown in 1776. He was promoted to an officer's rank and, of course, crossed Delaware with George Washington on the way to the Battle of Trenton. During the American Revolution, regimental units were required to take up arms and wear a continental uniform, if they could get their hands on one, that is. Every state had their own uniform regulations, and they were issued 1 to 2 uniforms per year. Officers during the first half of the war wore distinct features to mostly symbolize the rank until Congress installed a uniform or for a chain of command. Soldiers' coats were mostly made up of heavy grade wool, which, yes, is hot to the wear. Any reenactor can tell you that. But when they sweat, the wool acts as a built-in air conditioning system due to the natural fibers. Trousers or breeches were, of course, heavyweight linen. Now, if a soldier were to run out of their supply, well, as gruesome as this is going to sound, but this was true, they would literally take the articles of clothing off of other dead soldiers. I mean, they wouldn't be wearing them anymore, so use what you have. Also, socks were always the fastest and most common articles that wore out first. So again, I'm going to transition over to fashion and politics. And the reason why I have the United States support for the French Revolution is because with them being our neighbors and our brethren, or yeah, I believe brethren, the French Revolution was actually somewhat inspired by our revolution. So with them helping us out during our revolution, we definitely showed support. And this goes into a lot more with the Monroe family, and I'll get to that in a moment. Now, with the French Revolution beginning in 1789 and ending in 1799, after the revolution, the style that was made very popular, called the Rococo style, died instantly, mostly because no one wanted to get caught wearing a symbol of aristocracy. Mind you, this was a very, very dangerous thing to do. If you were caught wearing a robe à la française or a chemise à la reine, you were in a lot of trouble. Instead, people that represented the new republic, which they wore mostly a plain set of clothing or a cap or a cockade, which was made out of red, white, or blue ribbon, which is right here. After the Reign of Terror, a lot of people, mostly survivors of Versailles, began to wear black or morbid colors. This later, of course, became very fashionable. Now, here I happen to find this online. I'm not sure if this is a replica or an original, but these are actual guillotine earrings from the France's Reign of Terror in 1793. And as amazingly strange and gothic as this is just so very rare to see. You can actually find, I believe you can find replicas of this online for sale, but I just find this to be very fascinating. Now, during the reign of Napoleon Bonaparte, my apologies, the Monroe family were well befriended, and they often would visit France during the times of, during the times after the French Revolution, of course. Now, during their visit, they were enamored by the new French fashions, so your mid to late Federal period. And they would emulate this style back home in the United States. Now, as a result of its popularity among the Monroes and other high-profile families, the French style literally boomed here. And by then, it was the talk of the town, and it was just basically de mode. Everybody wanted to wear it. So now here we are with the early Federal period between 1795 and 1800. So again, as I mentioned, 1795, the silhouette has changed drastically. The silhouette now has become more natural. Women's clothing, instead of the traditional or conical shape of the 18th century, it has changed to the classical Greek style. This dress was mostly adopted as a revival. While the waistline was no longer at the hips, it was at the bust. And of course, this was your precursor for the Regency period. Men's clothing also changed as the waistcoat became shorter, and at the collar, it became higher in the back. Again, the tricorn is gone. Everybody is wearing top hats at this point. And these are just examples. So your petticoat and a jacket here, which was in the 1790s. And of course, your round gown. By then, this was mostly your generic. Everybody was wearing it at the time. And of course, your men's fashion at the period. As I mentioned, while men still kind of did wear breeches, you can see a different change, a drastic change in the style of dress, the different types of hats. You do not see any tricorns at all. The late federal period between 1850 and 1820. So after the War of 1812, the initial fashion did not change too much. The empire and federal style was still prevalent. However, the style did begin to emulate the soldiers' military uniforms. Case in point, the Spencer jacket. That began to don the braiding and intricate embellishments that you would see in military uniforms. By 1820, the style began to change just slightly. The shoulders began to balloon and taper off at the sleeve and give a more A-line style or bell shape to the silhouette. And of course, these are your examples, both your working class, your middle and upper class, and of course your evening wear. Menswear also changed. So your trousers were being worn instead of breeches. And of course, the coats were being elongated at the back and cut all the way across to the front. There was, I want to say your coats, they were more kind of, they were more closer to the, I can't think of the word, unfortunately. They were tailored to the body, but they also kind of streamlined out, almost like a skirt. That's what I was trying to get at. Apologize. So right here we have the lovely Mariah Monroe. She was married in 1820 to Samuel Lawrence Governor at the White House. This was the first wedding ever done after the burning of the White House. Contrary to popular tradition, as I mentioned before, not everybody wore white. However, this is an actual painting of Mariah. And of course, she is wearing white, but it also kind of looks a little bit of silver to me from my perspective. And again, wedding dresses were mostly your best gown that you wore for formal occasions. And the story goes that after the wedding, the family, or mostly Mariah and her husband, they decided to do a tour around with family, friends, and dignitaries. And one of the houses that was on tour for their wedding reception was the Decatur house. Now, the reason why I'm going to talk a little bit more about that is because with the next slide, it's literally going to transition into it. What happened is Stephen Decatur, while the party was being hosted at his house, he was in the middle of an altercation with another gentleman and did not tell his wife about his plans for a duel. So while the wedding reception was going on, of course, the duel was happening and he lost the duel. So unfortunately, he did die and just the whole party was ruined at this point, which goes into mourning of the 19th century. So by the turn of the century, mourning attire and protocol has changed. Mourners went back into full mourning. So you wore black for the first month, and of course, half mourning, which was purple, then blue, and then gray. Think about it as a bruise. Now, this also goes into not just the earlier part of the 19th century, so 1812, 1820, 1830, but this goes all across the board to almost 1900. So if you were to look online or do research or anything like that, you will find different mourning periods where you'll see people wearing blue or gray or purple, but mostly you're just going to see just full black. So finally, we get to clothing of the enslaved. Now, this goes for both 18th and 19th century. Mind you, unfortunately, I was not able to find an accurate photo of enslaved individuals in the early 19th century. So this is the later half. But to talk a little more about enslaved clothing, they were mostly issued clothes by their masters, depending on the occupation they were given. They were issued one or two sets of clothing, one for your spring and one for your winter. And you would have to wear them basically from spring to summer and then fall to winter. That's basically it. You were only given one pair of shoes, depending. Uh, if you were permitted to keep money, they would be able to purchase their own clothes that suited their own needs or their tastes, fabric, color, practicality. Again, the style and color was a nod to their identity and their African heritage. For example, red associated with the tribes such as the Himba or the Maasai tribe. Clothing was also made from common fabrics, so your wool, your linen, your cotton, your osnaburg, as I mentioned before, and which was a coarse woven fabric. Domestics working in the house wore what would appeal to the master's reputation and represented the mansion. So your maids, your butlers, etc. They all dressed in finer fabric compared to slaves, or I'm sorry, enslaved, who worked in the agricultural setting. They dressed generally for the environment that they worked in, whether it was in the fields, your ironworks, your water, your brickyard, etc. Excuse me. The other thing is the slaves in the Caribbean islands, they wore clothes that were more practical for the extreme heat and humidity. Now here I have runaway advertisements, and these would include what the person wore when they ran away and what types of clothing that they took with them. Case in point, this lady here, believed to be Mary Patterson, she brought with her, well, she ran away and had an old white bonnet, an old calico, I believe a blouse, a yellow spring gown, and an old blue quilt petticoat. So you will see things, examples such as this. Now, for free people, they basically wore whatever they had on them, whatever they could afford, whatever was practical, and mostly it kind of emulated the middle class. So there was no real distinct difference. Now, your head wraps or tignons. Now, this was a very important part of the culture and identity that was often covered in a cap or a headscarf. The headscarves consisted of a long square or a rectangle, like a handkerchief or a kerchief, that was twisted around the head to secure the hair. Sometimes another yard of fabric would be added for decoration, maybe shells, beads, etc. This also helped keep the hair clean and out of the way, especially if you were working. In New Orleans in 1793, the Tignon laws were put in place, unfortunately, to enforce that women who were Creole women who were either free or enslaved must keep their hair covered because, unfortunately, the hair was seen as a distraction. So my question for you, or actually the question in general, is how many clothes did a person typically own? Well, according to my sources, it all depended on what they could afford, much like today. There was a story of a middle-class woman's inventory that showed that she only had 7 to 10 garments in her possession. Now, we know there was probably a little bit more than what was in the inventory, but unfortunately it was not listed. But, you know, again, much like today, if you have the money to buy more clothing, then, you know, that's kind of what it was. But anyway, that's all I have. Okay. Oh,
If you want to turn back your camera on for questions.
okay.
We have a few questions. Miss Blank was wondering if sumptuary laws were enforced in America.
Sumptuary laws?
Yes. Michelle, do you want to answer that?
Sumptuary laws were non-forced in the colonies. The English government had enough problems enforcing everything else, so sumptuary laws was not a problem here.
Okay. And then another question from Jan would be, would the working class ladies wear a bum roll while working, or was it worn at all times?
That's a very good question. I would have to say it really depended on the wearer. If they wanted to, usually the thing is, like, if you're wearing a bum pad or a bum roll, it's not only to accentuate the hips to keep that conical shape or the
Mhm,
silhouette, but it also helped lift your skirts up to keep it from dragging on the ground.
mhm.
But again, it really depended on the wearer.
Okay. That's all the current questions we have. Michelle, do you have any questions? Jared, do you have any questions?
No.
Okay.
Wonderful.
Okay, perfect. And there is a little bit of a lag with Facebook Live, so if there's any more questions, Ms. Parker, I will direct them towards you. However, at this time, we're going to let Jared and Michelle share the artifacts that they have, the spotlight artifacts for the night.
Okay.
All right. Well, thank you so much. I certainly appreciate it. That was absolutely wonderful, Ms. Parker. We really, really appreciate that. Before I show what I have here, just wanted to thank so much to our sponsor, Walter J. Sheffield. Thank you so much to him. It's amazing that he's sponsoring us this evening. So, on behalf of us, thank you to you. I would like to show you something kind of cool, and this sort of is in line with what Ms. Parker was talking about. What I have here is, and I'll sort of hold this up here. I have James Monroe's court suit, and I am going to, this is his actual court suit, so it's pretty neat. Let me just sort of do a pass by of the camera. I'll sort of go along this way. So as you can see, it's made of silk velvet and decorated with cut steel buttons. The suit belonged to James Monroe, and it was worn during his second diplomatic mission to France. And as you can see, his suit is somewhat less ornate, right, than typical, French suits as you might think of. Interestingly, one of the things Ms. Parker brought up was the love of the color black. Well, there you go. This certainly qualifies for that. It's silk velvet. But one of the things that I wanted to talk about, particularly the suit, is one of the most extraordinary features of this suit to me is the cut steel buttons. And I'm going to show it up on the camera here, and then I'll show you something else. But it's a cut steel buttons. It's a fascinating, sort of often overlooked niche of accessories to fashion and to what folks are wearing. It's what they basically are is they are exactly what they sound like. They're pieces of cut steel. And I have a little sort of a close-up here that I wanted to show you. When you look at the buttons themselves, and I'll hold it, they don't really sparkle much in the fluorescent lights like you're seeing, but if you can imagine it with whale oil lamp or candlelight, they really would, sort of spark off and shine, and they would show that sort of, it looks like jewelry, it looks like diamonds, right? It's like, well, why does it look like diamonds? How is that possible? Well, let me show you. So here's a close-up of what it is. Interestingly, it sort of relates a little bit to sumptuary laws. It's speculated that one of the reasons it became popular is some of the sumptuary laws that were in place in France. But if you look at the close-up of the cut steel buttons, okay, what they would do is they would take individual rivets, right? And they would rivet it into the back plate of the button itself. So they'd have a back plate, and then they would rivet each individual ones. And not just that, but then they would facet the surface of each one of these. So each one of these are faceted with to look like a diamond. So you ever see a close-up of a diamond, they all had that faceted surface. And so that's exactly why it's faced like it looks like a diamond or a gemstone whenever it's shown in the light. And each one are meticulously done. Now, why don't we have them today? Well, we have them a little bit. You see a little bit, a little bit of these in buckles and things like that. And this sort of fell out of fashion somewhat in the later, 19th or in the later 19th century, sort of started dying down and became a little bit more cheaply made with strips rather, molded strips rather than individually cut. So they just sort of died off, but you still see it a little bit today. But anyway, I wanted to show you this because it just, to me, is a fascinating piece, and it sort of ties in with the aesthetics that Ms. Parker was talking about. So there it is. James Monroe's court suit is made out of silk velvet. And it's extraordinary the way that they would make velvet. You have the two pieces of fabric going together, and then a machine would cut them down the middle. So and that's where you get the fray. That's where you get that sort of sense, that sort of the surface of the velvet, as they say.
Jared,
yeah.
someone has a question and asked if the back is a shank.
Is the back a shank?
Yes.
Ooh, I'm sorry, I don't know what what they're talking about.
Okay.
Back shank.
Okay.
On
If
the
they
back,
follow up, if
if
they
they're
follow
talking,
up, I will let you know.
if they're talking about the button itself, I mean, it's definitely a back plate. Like it's a back plate of steel. You know, and it's in this highly polished itself. But yeah, I'm not sure. I'm not familiar with that term as far as these goes. I know the prison term, but not not for the jewelry. Anyway, sort of a beautiful suit. And I just wanted to show you that in sort of tandem with the presentation by Ms. Barker. And I know that Michelle has something to show as well, if she has there.
Yes, I do. Let me pop it up. One moment here, technology at its finest. So unlike the beautiful fabric,
Michelle, I'm sorry to interrupt. It's not showing on the screen.
I know, I'm trying to get it up.
Okay, sorry. If you're having technical problems, if you click share screen, it should pull up the presentation.
There it goes. I just had to get PowerPoint on, but okay, here we go. All right, technology at its finest. I'm an 18th century historian. This is what we do.
Perfect.
Can you see it?
Yes, we can.
Okay, good. Okay. So unlike the James Monroe Museum, unfortunately, we don't have any surviving pieces of Mary's garments intact. Again, her clothing was not as fashionable as the James Monroe family would be. She was definitely near the end of her life, a lot more simpler. And we know she liked to wear bed jackets, in very loose garments, and allowed her to be able to work in her gardens, ride her horses, get in her carriages, and especially near the end of her life as she's fighting up breast cancer, wearing stays, would have been extremely painful, as you imagine that they go up around the bust area. But one item we do have fabric related that is in our collection is this lovely little relic. It is a fabric swatch that belonged to Martha Washington. It was donated to the museum in the 1960s from members of the Custis Lee family. And you can obviously see that this was a cherished item. It's actually kept in a little daguerreotype case. So it's probably put in that around the 1850s, 1860s. It is about 2.5 inches. And it is a lovely little piece of brocade silk. So it's a silk taffeta with a brocade, likely would have been made in Europe, probably came out of England, and at this time period, we do see the beginning parts of some industrialization, but it's a lovely little piece that we have, and we bring it out every once in a while. So not as exotic as James Monroe's beautiful Kirk coat, but we do have a little piece that shows the fabric of the Washington family.
Perfect. And if you want to stop screen sharing and if everyone could come back on the screen, we have a few questions.
All right.
And just real quick, it was brought to my attention what the shank they're talking about, with the metal loop on the back of the button, and the answer is yes, they do have those on the back. So that's the answer to your question about the shank there.
Scott Harris would like to know, can any panelists comment on the ties between the rise of cotton textile production in Great Britain in the 18th century and the provisions of clothing for the enslaved African Americans?
I would have to say that that's kind of a hard question because the clothing that was made in England, Sorry, could you repeat the question again, please?
Yeah, sorry, I did read it a little fast. I'm sorry. Can any of the panelists comment on the ties between the rise of cotton textile production in Great Britain in the 18th century and the provisions of clothing for the enslaved?
I don't really think that there were actual ties. It was just whatever was given to the enslaved to wear.
Right.
If there were clothes, if there were textiles, if anything, they were made by people who were enslaved. It wasn't just England giving clothes to people to give to people who were enslaved. It was just kind of like giving, making an outfit for, not making an outfit, buying the fabrics, having somebody make the clothing and giving it as a uniform to somebody. So if you're thinking about it from that perspective, so it wasn't a predestined sort of trade. It was just kind of the way it was, really.
Right,
You think
right.
about it.
Perfect. I'm just making sure there's any more questions. And it seems to be it. Well, I want to thank you all deeply for your presentations tonight. They were intriguing and very enjoyable. A special thanks to Ms. Parker and Jared and Michelle for everything.
Thank you.
For everyone who enjoyed this program tonight, you can consider donating to the James Monroe Museum or Washington Heritage Museums. I did link both the donation buttons in the comments. It's pinned, so feel free to donate if you would like to. And also, please know that this program will be uploaded to our YouTube channel at some point for you to watch and enjoy. And just keep an eye out on our Facebook pages for that. So thank you
Okay.
so much. I'm going to end the live now.